Right now, as you hear these words, something strange is happening inside your skull. About half a second ago, neurons in your brain began firing in patterns that would eventually produce what you experience as the decision to keep listening. But here is the unsettling part. Those neurons started their work before you felt the urge to stay. Before you thought, "This sounds interesting," your brain had already committed to the action. The conscious experience of choosing arrived late, like a sports commentator narrating a play that already happened. You are not watching a live broadcast of your own decisions. You are watching a replay, and you have been watching a replay your entire life. This is not spiritual speculation. This is what neuroscientist Benjamin Libet discovered in a laboratory at the University of California in the early 1980s, and it has haunted philosophers, physicists, and contemplatives ever since. The feeling of being in charge, the sensation that there is a you at the helm steering the ship of your body through the waters of your life, may be the most convincing illusion the human mind has ever produced. Think about that for a moment. Every morning, you wake up and feel yourself begin the day. You decide to get out of bed. You decide to make coffee rather than tea. You decide which route to take to work. Each of these moments arise with the unmistakable sensation of authorship, the feeling that someone, namely you, is at the controls. But what if that feeling is like the experience of watching a magic trick? The magician's hand moves, the coin vanishes, and you swear you saw it disappear from one hand and appear in the other. Your experience is completely convincing, and it is completely wrong. The coin never left the first hand. Your experience was manufactured, a product of misdirection and expectation rather than of what actually happened. Now scale that up to every waking moment of your life. Every time you feel yourself choosing, every time you sense yourself deliberating, every time you experience that peculiar inner sensation of being the one who decides, what you are feeling may be the mind's version of the magician's sleight of hand. Not a lie exactly, more like a benevolent fiction, a story the brain tells itself because the story is useful, because it helps you navigate the world, because organisms that feel they are in charge tend to take responsibility for their actions, and taking responsibility confers survival advantages. The story is adaptive. That does not make it true. And yet, you are still here. You are still breathing. You will still make choices tomorrow about what to eat, where to go, what to say to the people you love. Life demands participation even when the question of who exactly is participating remains beautifully unanswered. The alarm clock will still ring. The dishes will still need washing. Your children will still need feeding. Your deadlines will still need meeting. Your relationships will still need tending. The fact that the feeling of control may be an illusion does not excuse you from the work of living. If anything, it makes the question of how to live more interesting, more urgent, more deeply worthy of your attention. Tonight, we are going to travel a long and winding road through some of the deepest questions human beings have ever asked. We will walk through the grand halls of classical physics, where the universe was once imagined as an enormous clock ticking forward with perfect mathematical precision. We will stand at the edge of chaos, where tiny shifts in wind and weather can unravel the best predictions human minds have ever made. We will descend into the quantum fog, where particles refuse to commit to being particles at all, and where the very act of looking at something changes what it is. We will examine what modern neuroscience has learned about the brain's role in creating the experience of free will. And then, gently, we will turn toward an ancient set of teachings from the Buddhist tradition, particularly the Zen lineage, which has been sitting quietly with these questions for over 2,500 years. Buddhism, it turns out, does not need to resolve the debate between determinism and free will. It does something far more radical. It lets go of the one who is asking. What we are exploring tonight is the illusion of control in a lawful universe. how physics reveals a cosmos that is deterministic in some places and probabilistic in others, how neuroscience suggests that the feeling of being in charge may be a construction rather than a reflection of reality, and how Buddhist practice offers a path of calm acceptance that is not fatalism, not passivity, not surrender, but something more spacious and more alive than any of those words can hold. You do not need any scientific background to follow what comes next. You do not need to be a Buddhist or even curious about Buddhism, though curiosity is always welcome. All you need is the willingness to sit with a question that the human mind has been circling for as long as human minds have existed. The question is simple. The answer is not. And the peace that comes from letting the question rest, from holding it gently rather than wrestling it to the ground, that peace might be closer than you think. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to control things that cannot be controlled. It is different from the healthy tiredness that follows physical work or intellectual effort. It is a bone-deep weariness, a tension that sits in the jaw and the shoulders and the space behind the eyes, a feeling of having been holding something up for so long that you have forgotten you are holding it. Many of the people who find their way to Buddhist practice or to any contemplative tradition arrive carrying this particular fatigue. They have spent years, sometimes decades, managing and planning and optimizing and worrying, and somewhere along the way, the project stopped working. The world kept doing what it was going to do regardless. The plans kept unraveling. The certainties kept dissolving. And the exhaustion of trying to hold it all together became, at some point, greater than the fear of letting go. If any of that resonates with where you are tonight, this conversation is for you. Not as a prescription, not as a set of instructions for how to live your life, but as an invitation to consider the possibility that the grip can be loosened, that the holding on is optional, and that on the other side of letting go is not the void, but something surprisingly solid. So settle in. Let your body soften. Let your breath find its own rhythm without forcing it into any particular shape. And let us begin where all good stories about control begin, with a man who believed the entire future of the universe could be calculated by a single, sufficiently intelligent mind. In 1814, the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace published a book called A Philosophical Essay on Probabilities. In it, he described a thought experiment that would echo through the centuries. Imagine, Laplace wrote, an intellect vast enough to know the precise position and momentum of every single particle in the universe at a given moment. Imagine that this intellect also understood every law governing the way those particles interact. For such an intelligence, Laplace argued, nothing would be uncertain. The future would be laid out as clearly as the past. Every raindrop, every heartbeat, every whispered confession in the dark, all of it calculable, all of it determined from the very first instant of creation. Laplace himself never used the word demon. That came later, a label attached by others who found something unsettling about the idea. But the concept stuck. Laplace's demon became shorthand for a particular vision of the universe, a cosmos running on rails, a machine of unimaginable complexity but absolute precision, where everything that will ever happen was already encoded in whatever happened at the very beginning. This vision did not emerge from nowhere. It grew from the soil of Isaac Newton's extraordinary achievements. In 1687, Newton published his Principia Mathematica, a work that laid down 3 laws of motion and a universal law of gravitation. With these tools, Newton showed that the motion of planets, the arc of a thrown stone, the rhythms of the tides, all of these could be described by the same set of mathematical principles. The universe, it seemed, obeyed rules, and those rules were knowable. The power of Newtonian mechanics was staggering. You could take a cannonball, measure its initial velocity and the angle at which it was fired, account for gravity and air resistance, and predict with breathtaking accuracy where it would land. You could do the same with the moon, tracking its orbit around the Earth decade after decade with almost no discrepancy between prediction and observation. The planets moved as the equations said they would. Eclipses arrived on schedule. Comets returned when promised. For anyone living in the centuries following Newton, this predictability felt like a revelation. The universe was not arbitrary. It was not governed by the whims of capricious gods or demons hurling lightning bolts from mountaintops. It was a mechanism, elegant and law-abiding, and the human mind could learn to read its blueprints. The implications were intoxicating. If the movement of the planets could be predicted with such precision, why not the movement of everything? Why not the flight of birds, the flow of rivers, the behavior of gases, the course of a human life? The enlightenment that followed Newton's discoveries was, in many ways, a celebration of this idea. Reason could penetrate the workings of nature. The universe was intelligible. The laws that governed the falling of an apple also governed the orbits of distant stars. There was a majestic unity to it all, a sense that beneath the bewildering variety of natural phenomena lay a small set of simple, beautiful, universal principles. The Scottish philosopher David Hume noted that the regularity of causes and effects was the foundation on which all human reasoning about the world depended. We observe that one billiard ball strikes another and the second moves. We observe this happening consistently, and we infer a causal connection. The entire edifice of science rests on this inference. The assumption that the future will resemble the past, that the same causes will produce the same effects, that the laws of nature do not change from one moment to the next. This is what we might call the clockwork dream. The idea that reality, at its most fundamental level, operates like an enormous, infinitely precise clock. Every gear interlocks with every other gear. Every tick follows inevitably from the tick before it. If you could somehow freeze the clock at any moment and examine the exact position of every component, you would know with certainty every moment that would follow. The past determines the present, and the present determines the future, in an unbroken chain of cause and effect stretching from the beginning of time to its end. Picture it. You are standing in a vast room, impossibly large, stretching in every direction as far as you can see. The room is filled with gears, tiny gears the size of atoms, enormous gears the size of galaxies. And every gear is turning, meshing with its neighbors, transferring motion through the system with absolute, mathematical precision. You cannot see the edges of the room because there are no edges. The machine is the universe, and the universe is the machine, and it has been running since the moment of creation, and it will run until the moment, if there is one, when it finally winds down. In this picture, every event that has ever occurred or ever will occur was already implicit in the initial conditions of the universe. The explosion of a supernova 10 billion years ago, the formation of the solar system, the emergence of life on Earth, the particular arrangement of neurons in your brain at this exact moment. All of it was set in motion at the first instant and has been unfolding with clock-like inevitability ever since. Your birth, your death, the words you are hearing right now, the thoughts those words are producing in your mind, determined, fixed, settled, not from the moment of your birth, but from the moment of the Big Bang. The clockwork dream had consequences that extended far beyond physics. If the universe was fully determined by its initial conditions and the laws governing it, then what did that mean for human beings? We are, after all, made of the same atoms that make up cannonballs and planets. Our brains are physical systems, governed by the same forces as everything else. If the trajectory of a thrown ball is determined by its starting conditions, then is the trajectory of a human life determined in the same way? This question troubled people then, and it troubles people now. It strikes at the heart of something most of us hold dear without ever really examining it. The belief that we are, in some meaningful sense, the authors of our own lives. That when we make a choice, something real is happening, something that could genuinely have gone a different way. The Clockwork Dream threatens to reduce that sense of authorship to an elaborate hallucination, a story the brain tells itself while the gears turn exactly as they were always going to turn. But Laplace was writing in 1814, and he could not have known what was coming. The clockwork was about to develop some very interesting cracks. Even within the Newtonian framework, there were hints that perfect prediction was not as straightforward as the dream suggested. The French mathematician Henri Poincaré, working in the 1880s on the three-body problem, the question of how three gravitational bodies move in relation to each other, discovered something disturbing. While the motion of two bodies under mutual gravitation can be solved exactly, adding just one more body makes the system extraordinarily sensitive to its starting conditions. Tiny differences in the initial positions or velocities of three orbiting bodies could produce wildly different outcomes over time. The equations were still deterministic. Given exactly the same starting conditions, you would always get exactly the same result. But exactly turned out to be doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. Poincaré glimpsed something that would not be fully understood for another century. He saw that deterministic systems could produce behavior that looked, for all practical purposes, random. He saw that the clockwork could be perfect in principle and useless in practice. And he saw that the dream of Laplace, the dream of a mind that could predict the entire future from a single snapshot of the present, was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The Newtonian universe remained gloriously successful at prediction within certain boundaries. Send a spacecraft to Jupiter, and Newtonian mechanics will get you there. Build a bridge, and the forces can be calculated with precision that keeps it standing. At the scale of everyday engineering and astronomy, the clockwork works beautifully. But consider what this framework does to a human being who takes it seriously. If you are a thinking person living in the 18th or 19th century, and you have absorbed the implications of Newtonian determinism, you are forced to confront something deeply unsettling about your own inner life. Every feeling you have ever had, every dream, every moment of inspiration, every flash of anger, was not truly yours. It was the universe expressing itself through you, the way a wave expresses itself through water. The wave does not choose to crest. It crests because that is what the physics demands. And you do not choose to fall in love, or to grieve, or to wonder about the stars. You do these things because the atoms in your brain are arranged in a particular configuration that was set in motion billions of years before you drew your first breath. The philosopher William James, writing in the late 19th century, described the emotional weight of this view as a kind of suffocation. He called it the dilemma of determinism. If the future is fixed, then regret is irrational, because nothing could have been otherwise. Moral outrage is irrational, because the criminal could not have chosen differently. Hope is irrational, because what will happen regardless of what you wish for. The entire emotional landscape of human life, all the striving and caring and mourning and celebrating, rests on a foundation of illusion. We feel as if our choices matter, but the clockwork says they do not. This is not merely an abstract philosophical problem. It is a lived experience. Anyone who has lain awake at night, turning over a decision, agonizing over what to do, rehearsing conversations, planning contingencies, knows the grip of the belief that getting it right matters, that choosing well is both possible and important. Newtonian determinism does not just challenge this belief intellectually. It dissolves it. And in its place, it offers nothing but the cold comfort that whatever happens was always going to happen. Some thinkers found peace in this. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Rome, centuries before Newton, had arrived at a similar conclusion through different reasoning. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal while commanding Roman legions on the frontier, counseled himself to accept the flow of events as natural and necessary. "What stands in the way becomes the way," he wrote. "The obstacle is the material for action." But Stoic acceptance was rooted in a belief in a rational, purposeful cosmos, a universe guided by a divine reason called the Logos. Newtonian determinism offered no such warmth. Its universe was not guided by reason. It was guided by equations, and equations do not care. But the universe is not made only of bridges and spacecraft. It is also made of weather systems that shift without warning, of populations that boom and collapse in ways no one anticipated, of economies that crash for reasons that seem obvious only in hindsight. Beneath the tidy surface of classical mechanics, something wilder was stirring. In the winter of 1961, a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz was working at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, running computer simulations of weather patterns. The computers of that era were slow by modern standards, and Lorenz was impatient. He wanted to rerun a particular simulation from a point midway through, so instead of starting from the beginning, he typed in the numbers from a printout. But the printout had rounded one of the values. Where the computer had stored the number 0.506127, the printout showed 0.506. The difference was tiny, less than 1 part in 1,000. Lorenz expected the new simulation to produce results nearly identical to the original. It did not. The weather patterns diverged rapidly and completely. What had started as a barely perceptible difference exploded into a totally different forecast within a simulated few days. Same equations, same physics, a difference smaller than a rounding error, and the entire future changed. Lorenz had stumbled upon one of the most profound discoveries of 20th century mathematics. He called it sensitive dependence on initial conditions. The rest of the world would come to know it by a more evocative name, drawn from the title of a talk Lorenz gave in 1972 at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? The butterfly effect, not a poetic exaggeration, but a mathematical reality. In certain kinds of systems, called chaotic systems, immeasurably small differences in starting conditions can produce enormous differences in outcomes. And these systems are not exotic rarities. They are everywhere. The weather is chaotic. The flow of water in a stream is chaotic. The orbit of Pluto, over millions of years, is chaotic. The beating of the human heart, under certain conditions, can become chaotic. What makes chaos theory so philosophically interesting is what it is not. It is not randomness. Chaotic systems are completely deterministic. The equations governing them contain no element of chance. If you could specify the initial conditions with truly infinite precision, and if you had unlimited computational power, you could predict the future of a chaotic system as far ahead as you liked. Laplace's demon, with its omniscient knowledge of every particle, would have no trouble. But that is exactly the point. No real observer, no physical instrument, no computer that could ever be built can specify initial conditions with infinite precision. There is always some uncertainty, some margin of error, some digit left unrecorded. And in a chaotic system, that tiny margin of error does not remain tiny. It grows. It multiplies. It compounds. It inflates with a relentless mathematical vigor until the original measurement is useless and the future has become, for all practical purposes, unknowable. This is determinism without predictability. The universe is following its rules perfectly, every atom doing exactly what the laws of physics demand. But those same rules generate a complexity so vast that no mind could ever trace it. The gears of the clock mesh with flawless precision, but the clock has so many gears, interacting in such intricate ways that reading the time becomes impossible. Consider what this means for the clockwork dream. Laplace imagined his demon as a thought experiment, a way of illustrating the logical implications of determinism. But chaos theory reveals that even within a perfectly deterministic universe, the demon is not merely impractical, but something closer to impossible. The information required for perfect prediction does not just exceed the capacity of any conceivable computer. It exceeds the capacity of the universe itself to encode. The physicist Sean Carroll has noted that Newtonian mechanics describes a deterministic, clockwork universe. In principle, but in practice, chaotic dynamics can amplify tiny imperfections in the initial knowledge of a system into complete uncertainty later on. The dream of perfect prediction collapses not because the laws are imperfect, but because the world is too rich, too interwoven, too gloriously tangled for any finite mind to hold. And notice something else. The butterfly effect means that everything is connected to everything, not in a loose, metaphorical way, but in a precise, mathematical way. The temperature of your morning coffee affects the air around it. That air affects the air around it. That air affects the air around it. Given enough time and the right conditions, those tiny thermal fluctuations participate in the vast, planetary-scale dance of atmospheric dynamics that we experience as weather. You are not separate from the weather. Your coffee is not separate from the weather. Nothing is separate from anything. The mathematician and meteorologist Edward Lorenz once said that if the theory of sensitive dependence on initial conditions were correct, then a single flap of a seagull's wing would be enough to alter the course of the weather forever. He later replaced the seagull with a butterfly, and the image stuck. But the point is the same. In a chaotic system, there are no unimportant events. Every vibration, every fluctuation, every breath of wind participates in the determination of the future. The web of causation is total. What Lorenz had found in his weather simulations was the same thing Poincaré had glimpsed in his study of orbital mechanics decades earlier. Determinism and predictability are not the same thing. The universe can be law-abiding down to its smallest components and still be, for all practical purposes, full of genuine surprise. There is something almost poetic about this. The butterfly does not intend to cause a tornado. The tornado does not remember the butterfly. The chain of causation linking them is too long, too convoluted, too impossibly intricate for any human mind to follow. And yet the connection is real. Every breath of wind is linked to every other breath of wind in a web of cause and effect that spans the entire atmosphere. We experience the consequences of this in our daily lives far more often than we realize. You leave for work 5 minutes late because you could not find your keys. You catch a different train. On that train, you sit next to someone who mentions a job opening. 6 months later, your entire career has changed. Was that fate? Was it coincidence? Neither word quite captures it. It was chaos, the lawful, deterministic, and yet utterly unpredictable sensitivity of complex systems to their initial conditions. Your misplaced keys did not cause your career change any more than the butterfly caused the tornado. But without the keys, without the timing, without the particular seat on the particular train, the path would have been different. The web of causation is real, and it is so intricate that tracing it backward is as hopeless as predicting it forward. This begins to sound, if you listen carefully, a great deal like something a Buddhist monk might say. The idea that all phenomena arise in dependence upon other phenomena, that nothing exists in isolation, that the universe is an interdependent web of conditions giving rise to conditions. This is the principle of dependent origination, one of the most fundamental insights in the Buddhist tradition. We will return to that teaching in detail later. For now, notice how the Western scientific understanding of complexity and interconnection arrived. by a very different path, at a destination that Buddhist contemplatives had been describing for millennia. Chaos shows up in the human body, too, in ways that are both fascinating and deeply relevant to our theme. The beating of a healthy heart is not, as you might expect, perfectly regular. Cardiologists have discovered that a healthy heartbeat contains a subtle degree of irregularity, a kind of controlled chaos that reflects the heart's ability to respond flexibly to changing conditions. Paradoxically, it is an overly regular heartbeat that signals trouble. A heart that has lost its chaotic variability has lost its adaptability. It has become too rigid, too locked into a single pattern, and that rigidity is a sign of disease. The same is true of brain activity. Healthy neural function involves a balance between order and chaos. Too much order, and the brain becomes locked into rigid patterns, as in certain forms of epilepsy, where the neurons fall into an abnormally synchronized firing pattern that overwhelms normal function. Too little order, and the brain cannot maintain coherent thought or coordinated action. Health, both physical and mental, lives in the space between perfect order and total randomness, in the fertile zone where patterns form and dissolve and reform, responsive to conditions, never quite repeating themselves. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it offers a physical metaphor for the kind of inner life that the Buddhist tradition points toward. The healthy heart is not a controlled heart. It is a responsive heart. It does not beat to a rigid schedule. It adjusts, moment by moment, to the demands of the body, speeding up when you climb stairs, slowing down when you rest, fluctuating in subtle ways that reflect the ongoing conversation between the heart and the environment it serves. The healthy mind, similarly, is not a controlled mind. It is an attentive mind, one that responds to conditions with flexibility rather than rigidity, that adapts rather than insists, that flows rather than freezes. The desire to control the mind, to make it calm, to make it focused, to make it productive, to make it stop worrying, is itself a form of the rigidity that undermines health. It is the mental equivalent of trying to force the heart into a perfectly regular rhythm. It might seem like the goal should be a still, orderly mind, but what the contemplative traditions and the neuroscience both suggest is that a mind at ease is not a mind under control. It is a mind that has learned to tolerate its own natural variability, to trust the process of thinking and feeling without needing to manage it, to allow thoughts to arise and pass away the way weather systems arise and pass away across the surface of the planet. But chaos was only the beginning of the unraveling. There was another crack in the Newtonian edifice, one that had been discovered decades before Lorenz sat down at his computer. This one did not merely make prediction difficult. It made certain kinds of prediction, in principle, impossible, not because of our limitations as observers, because of the way reality itself is structured. In 1927, a 25-year-old German physicist named Werner Heisenberg was working at the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen when he formulated what would become one of the most famous principles in all of science. He called them indeterminacy relations, though the world would come to know them by another name, the uncertainty principle. Heisenberg showed that there is a fundamental limit to how precisely you can simultaneously know certain pairs of physical properties. Position and momentum are the classic pairing. The more accurately you pin down where a particle is, the less accurately you can know how fast it is moving and in which direction, and vice versa. This is not a statement about the clumsiness of our instruments. It is not that better microscopes could, someday, overcome the limitation. The uncertainty is woven into the fabric of reality itself. A particle does not have a perfectly defined position and a perfectly defined momentum at the same time. The universe simply does not work that way at the smallest scales. To understand why this matters, consider what it does to Laplace's demon. The demon needs to know the exact position and exact momentum of every particle in the universe. Heisenberg's principle says that such knowledge is not merely difficult to obtain. It is, in the deepest sense, not there to be obtained. The information does not exist. The universe does not store it. At the quantum level, reality has a built-in blurriness that no amount of cleverness can penetrate. Heisenberg himself captured the philosophical weight of his discovery with a single, striking observation. "What we observe," he wrote, "is not nature in itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." If the uncertainty principle were merely about measurement, it would be interesting but perhaps not revolutionary. After all, measurement has always been imprecise. What makes quantum mechanics genuinely strange is that it does not simply limit what we can know. It appears to limit what exists. This is where the famous double-slit experiment enters the story. First performed with light by Thomas Young in 1801, and later repeated with electrons and even molecules, the experiment reveals something that defies ordinary intuition so completely that the physicist Richard Feynman declared it contained the only mystery of quantum mechanics. The setup is deceptively simple. You have a barrier with two narrow slits in it. On one side, you fire particles, say electrons, one at a time, toward the barrier. On the other side, you have a detection screen that records where each electron hits. If electrons were simply tiny balls, you would expect them to pass through one slit or the other, and you would see two bands of hits on the screen, one corresponding to each slit. This is what classical particles do, but that is not what happens. When you fire electrons one at a time and let the pattern build up over many firings, you get an interference pattern, a series of alternating bright and dark bands that is characteristic of waves. It is as though each electron passes through both slits simultaneously and interferes with itself on the other side. One electron, two paths, one arrival point. An impossible result for anything that behaves purely as a particle. The strangeness deepens when you try to observe which slit each electron passes through. If you place a detector at the slits to catch the electron in the act of choosing, the interference pattern vanishes. The electrons behave like particles again, passing through one slit or the other, but not both. The act of observation collapses the wave-like behavior into particle-like behavior. It is important to clarify what observation means here. It does not require a conscious human mind peering through a microscope. It requires any physical interaction that could, in principle, reveal which path the particle took. The electron does not care whether a person is watching. It responds to the physical conditions of the experiment. But those physical conditions determine whether reality manifests as a wave or as a particle, as possibility or as fact. The standard framework for making sense of this, often called the Copenhagen interpretation and developed by Bohr and Heisenberg in the late 1920s, holds that quantum objects do not have definite properties until they are measured. Before measurement, an electron exists in a superposition of states, a mathematical cloud of probabilities. It is not that we do not know which slit the electron went through. It is that the question has no answer until the measurement is made. Reality, at the quantum level, is fundamentally probabilistic. Sit with that for a moment. It is not that our instruments are too crude. It is not that we lack information. It is that the information does not exist. The electron, until measured, genuinely has no definite position. It is suspended in a haze of possibility, a mathematical phantom that becomes concrete only when the world asks it a specific question. Before the question is asked, there is no answer. Not a hidden answer. No answer at all. This is so deeply counterintuitive that the greatest minds in physics have struggled with it for nearly a century. We are creatures of the macroscopic world, a world where things have definite positions and definite speeds, and where looking at something does not change what it is. The quantum world obeys different rules, rules that our evolved intuitions were never designed to comprehend. The philosopher and physicist David Bohm once compared our situation to that of a fish trying to understand the concept of water. We are so immersed in our experience of the classical, macroscopic world that we take its features to be universal truths. Objects have definite locations. Causes precede effects. Looking does not disturb. But these are not universal truths. They are features of our particular scale of experience. At the quantum scale, they break down, and something stranger and more beautiful takes their place. Now, not everyone accepts the Copenhagen interpretation. Einstein famously resisted it. God does not play dice, he said, expressing his deep discomfort with a universe that contained irreducible randomness. He spent years devising thought experiments intended to show that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, that there must be hidden variables, deeper deterministic laws lurking beneath the probabilistic surface. But experiment after experiment has sided with the quantum view. The 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Alain Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger for experiments testing Bell's theorem, which demonstrated that quantum mechanics cannot be explained by local hidden variables. The universe, it seems, really does involve fundamental probabilities at its deepest level. Nature does play dice, or something very much like it, and no amount of human ingenuity can peek behind the curtain to find the loaded dice that would restore determinism. What Bell's theorem actually showed, and what the experiments of Aspect, Clauser, and Zeilinger confirmed, is remarkable enough to be worth pausing on. In 1964, the Northern Irish physicist John Stuart Bell devised a mathematical test that could distinguish between two possibilities. Either quantum mechanics is a complete description of reality at the fundamental level, meaning that the apparent randomness is real, or there are hidden variables, deeper deterministic factors that we have not yet discovered, secretly pulling the strings behind the scenes. Bell showed that if hidden variables exist, the correlations between certain measurements on pairs of entangled particles would obey a particular mathematical limit, a ceiling that they could not exceed. If quantum mechanics is correct and the randomness is genuine, the correlations would exceed that limit. The experiments, first conducted by Clauser and Friedman in the 1970s, and then refined to ever greater precision by Aspect in the 1980s and Zeilinger in the decades that followed, showed beyond reasonable doubt that the correlations exceed Bell's limit. The universe violates the hidden variable prediction. This means, in the interpretation shared by most working physicists, that the randomness of quantum mechanics is not a gap in our knowledge. It is not ignorance dressed up as uncertainty. It is a feature of reality itself, built into the foundation of the cosmos in a way that no future discovery is likely to overturn. For those of us thinking about control, this is significant. It means that the universe contains genuine openness at its deepest level, not just the practical unpredictability of chaos, where the determinism is real but the prediction is impossible, but a fundamental indeterminacy, a place where multiple outcomes are genuinely possible and nature chooses among them in a way that appears to be irreducibly spontaneous. Or does it? Some interpretations, like the many worlds interpretation championed by physicists such as Sean Carroll, hold that the underlying reality is entirely deterministic. Every time a quantum measurement is made, the universe branches into multiple copies, one for each possible outcome. In this view, there is no randomness, only an ever-splitting tree of equally real parallel worlds. You do not roll a die. The universe divides so that every face comes up, each in its own branch. This interpretation has the virtue of preserving determinism at the level of the total wave function, but the cost is staggering. A multiplicity of equally real universes, most of which you will never experience. branching off from this one at every quantum event, which is to say constantly, billions upon billions of times per second. Whether the ultimate nature of reality is truly random or deterministically branching remains an open question, one of the deepest in all of physics. But for our purposes tonight, what matters is the practical consequence. From the perspective of any observer within the universe, quantum mechanics introduces a fundamental unpredictability into the behavior of matter. No amount of information about a quantum system before measurement can tell you, with certainty, what the measurement will reveal. You can calculate probabilities. You can make predictions that are extraordinarily accurate when applied to large numbers of events. But for any single quantum event, the outcome is genuinely uncertain. This is a very different kind of uncertainty from the chaos we discussed earlier. In chaotic systems, the unpredictability arises from our inability to measure initial conditions with perfect precision. The determinism is still there, hidden behind a wall of complexity. In quantum mechanics, the unpredictability appears to be fundamental. It is not hiding anything. There is nothing behind the curtain. So where does this leave us? The classical picture of the universe was deterministic. Every event follows inevitably from the events that preceded it. Chaos theory showed that even within a deterministic framework, practical prediction can be impossible because of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Quantum mechanics goes further, suggesting that at the most fundamental level, the universe contains genuine randomness, events whose outcomes are not determined by anything that came before. The universe, it turns out, is neither the clockwork of Laplace's dream nor the spinning roulette wheel of pure chance. It is something stranger and more interesting than either. It is a world where large-scale objects like planets and billiard balls follow deterministic laws with extraordinary precision, while the microscopic building blocks of those same objects dance to a probabilistic rhythm. It is a world where knowing everything about the present does not, even in principle, tell you everything about the future. For a person lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering whether their life is genuinely theirs to shape or merely a movie they are watching with a convincing illusion of control, these are not abstract questions. They reach into the core of what it means to be a conscious being in a physical universe. And they become even more urgent when we turn our attention from the physics of the very large and the very small to something closer to home, the human brain. But before we arrive at the brain, there is one more physical law worth sitting with, because it touches on something that every human being experiences directly, every single day, and because it connects to the Buddhist tradition in a way that is both precise and deeply moving. That law is the second law of thermodynamics, and the experience it describes is impermanence. The second law states, in its simplest formulation, that the entropy of an isolated system tends to increase over time. Entropy is a measure of disorder, or more precisely, a measure of the number of microscopic arrangements that a system could have while still looking the same from the outside. A freshly built sandcastle has low entropy. There are very few ways to arrange those grains of sand that produce a sandcastle. A pile of sand on a flat beach has high entropy. There are astronomically many ways to arrange grains of sand that produce a shapeless pile. The second law says that, left to itself, the sandcastle will become the pile, and the pile will never spontaneously reassemble into the sandcastle. Not because it is forbidden by any law, but because the odds against it are so staggeringly large that in all the time the universe has left to exist, it will almost certainly never happen. This is why your coffee cools. This is why your car rusts. This is why the memories of your childhood grow hazier year by year, as the neural connections that encode them gradually shift and degrade. This is why your body, that extraordinary self-repairing machine, eventually reaches a point where it can no longer repair itself. and the order that you call your life gives way to the disorder that the universe has been quietly, patiently working towards since the moment you were born. The physicist Arthur Eddington once wrote that the second law of thermodynamics holds the supreme position among the laws of nature. If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, there is nothing for it. Your theory will collapse in deepest humiliation. That is how fundamental this law is. It is not a suggestion. It is not a tendency that might occasionally reverse itself. It is the deep, statistical grain of the universe, the direction that reality flows. And the arrow of time itself, the felt sense that the past is behind you and the future is ahead, that moments arise and pass and do not return, is intimately connected to the increase of entropy. At the level of fundamental physics, the equations governing particles are time-symmetric. They work equally well whether you play them forward or backward. But at the level of systems with many particles, which is the level of everything you will ever touch or see or hear, the arrow of time points relentlessly in one direction, toward greater entropy, toward greater dispersal, toward the dissolution of every ordered structure that has ever formed. Now listen to the Pali Canon, the earliest recorded teachings of the historical Buddha. Sabsankara anicca. All conditioned things are impermanent. This is not a casual observation. It is the first of the three marks of existence in the Buddhist tradition, the three characteristics that are said to be shared by every phenomenon in the universe without exception. Everything that has come together will come apart. Everything that has arisen will pass away. Every compound thing carries within it the conditions of its own dissolution. The resonance between these two insights, one arrived at through mathematics and experiment, the other through sustained contemplative observation, is striking. The physicist and the monk are describing the same landscape from different vantage points. The physicist says, entropy increases and ordered structures decay. The monk says, all conditioned things are impermanent, and clinging to them causes suffering. The physicist measures the decay with thermometers and calorimeters. The monk observes it with the instrument of sustained, disciplined attention directed inward at the arising and passing of every sensation, every thought, every moment of experience. And both arrive at the same practical conclusion, though they express it in different languages. You cannot hold on to things, not because you are weak, not because you are failing at some task that a stronger or wiser person would succeed at. You cannot hold on to things because the nature of things is to change. Trying to freeze a river is not a sign of effort. It is a misunderstanding of rivers. This is the deepest source of the illusion of control. Not just the quantum uncertainty that makes precise prediction impossible at the smallest scales. Not just the chaos that makes practical prediction impossible at larger scales. But the relentless, irreversible increase of entropy that guarantees that every structure you build, every plan you make, every arrangement of your life that you have labored to create will eventually come undone. Not because something went wrong, because this is what the universe does. This is the direction that time flows. And to resist it is not courageous. It is exhausting. It is the source of the particular kind of tiredness that no amount of sleep can fix. The weariness that comes from spending your life trying to hold back a tide that has been rising since the beginning of everything. The Buddhist response to this is not grief. It is not despair. It is something more like the deep exhalation of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and finally lets it go. If everything is impermanent, then the project of securing yourself, of arranging the world so that you are safe and comfortable and certain of the future, is not merely difficult. It is impossible. And once you truly see that, once you let that truth settle into your bones and not just your intellect, something loosens. The grip relaxes, not because you have given up, but because you have finally understood what your hands were trying to hold. You are sitting in a laboratory. A clock face glows on the wall in front of you, with a single circling its perimeter like a racing second hand. You have been given a simple instruction. At any moment of your choosing, flex your wrist. The only requirement is that when you feel the urge to move, you note the position of the dot on the clock face. Meanwhile, electrodes attached to your scalp are recording the electrical activity of your brain. This was the experimental setup used by Benjamin Libet and his colleagues at the University of California, San Francisco, in a landmark study published in 1983. And the results sent shockwaves through philosophy, neuroscience, and any field that cared about the nature of human agency. What Libet found was this. The brain produced a distinctive pattern of electrical activity called the readiness potential, a slow buildup of negative voltage centered over the motor areas of the cortex that began approximately 550 milliseconds before the participant actually flexed their wrist. This was not especially surprising. It was already known that voluntary movements are preceded by preparatory brain activity. The surprising part was the timing. When participants reported the moment they first felt the conscious urge to move, that moment occurred roughly 200 milliseconds before the movement itself, but a full 350 milliseconds after the readiness potential had already begun. The brain had started the process of initiating the movement about a third of a second before the person felt that they had decided to move. Let that settle for a moment. The electrical storm in the brain that sets a voluntary action in motion begins before the conscious experience of intending to act. The decision, or at least its neural preparation, appears to precede the awareness of the decision. Libet himself was careful about what this meant. He noted that participants still reported the ability to veto the movement at the last moment, to feel the urge but cancel the action before the wrist actually flexed. He proposed that while the initiation of a voluntary act begins unconsciously, consciousness retains what he called veto power, a kind of free won't, if not quite free will. The brain proposes, consciousness, perhaps, can still dispose. But others drew more dramatic conclusions. The psychologist Daniel Wegner, in his 2002 book The Illusion of Conscious Will, argued that the everyday feeling of being the conscious author of your own actions is, in his words, the mind's best trick. Wegner conducted a series of experiments showing how easily the sense of authorship could be manipulated. In one experiment, he had participants watch a cursor move on a screen while hearing words through headphones. When the cursor stopped near an object that matched a word they had just heard, participants were more likely to feel that they had controlled the cursor, even when they had not. Wegner proposed 3 principles that govern the experience of conscious will. First, the thought must appear in consciousness just before the action. Second, the thought must be consistent with the action. Third, there must be no obvious alternative cause for the action. When these conditions are met, we feel that we consciously caused the action. When they are not met, even actions we genuinely performed can feel involuntary, as in the eerie phenomenon of alien hand syndrome, where damage to certain brain regions causes a person's hand to act seemingly of its own accord, unbuttoning a shirt the other hand just buttoned. In 2008, a study by John Dylan Haynes and his colleagues at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Berlin pushed the timeline even further. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging, they found that patterns of brain activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortex could predict which of 2 buttons a participant would press up to 7 seconds before the participant reported making a conscious decision. 7 seconds. In neural terms, that is an eternity. Now, these findings have been debated extensively, and they should be. A 2021 meta-analysis of Libet-style studies found that while the pattern of the readiness potential preceding conscious intention is real, the effect is uncertain and based on a small number of studies. Some researchers, notably Aaron Scherger and his colleagues, have argued that the readiness potential may not represent a causal antecedent of the decision at all, but rather a gradual accumulation of random neural noise that crosses a threshold, much like the way a heavy raindrop eventually forms from the random collision of countless tiny water droplets. In this view, the readiness potential does not mean the brain decided before you did. It means the brain was getting ready to do anything, and the conscious decision emerged from the moment the noise happened to tip past a threshold. Others point out that the Libet experiment involves a very peculiar kind of decision, flexing your wrist at an arbitrary moment for no reason. This is nothing like the complex, value-laden, deeply contextual decisions that make up the fabric of a human life. Choosing whom to marry, whether to change careers, how to respond to a friend in distress. These are decisions shaped by memories, values, emotions, social contexts, and ongoing deliberation. It is far from clear that what happens in a laboratory when someone wiggles their wrist on command tells us anything meaningful about those richer, more human forms of choosing. And yet, even with all these caveats, the Libet experiments and their descendants point towards something that is difficult to ignore. The feeling of being in control, the sensation that I am the originating cause of my own actions, may not be a transparent window onto the causal process that actually produces behavior. It may be a construction, an after-the-fact narrative that the brain generates to help organize experience and assign responsibility. You act, and then you feel as though you decided to act, and the feeling is so immediate and so vivid that questioning it seems absurd. Daniel Wegner put it memorably. The experience of conscious will, he wrote, is the feeling that we are doing things. This feeling occurs for many things we do, conveying to us again and again the sense that we consciously cause our actions. But the feeling may not be a true reading of what is happening in our minds, brains, and bodies as our actions are produced. This finding has been replicated and extended many times since Wegner's original work. In one particularly striking experiment, subjects were asked to move a cursor on a screen using a mouse. Unknown to them, the cursor's movements were sometimes being controlled by a hidden experimenter. When the cursor landed on an object that the subject had been thinking about, even if the hidden experimenter had moved it there, the subject reported feeling that they had caused the cursor to stop on that object. The mere coincidence between intention and outcome was enough to generate the subjective experience of authorship. The mind, it seemed, was not reporting what actually happened. It was constructing a story about what happened, a story in which the self was always the protagonist. You have almost certainly experienced this in your own life without recognizing it. Think of a time when you made a decision after agonizing over it for hours, only to realize later that you had already known what you were going to do from the beginning. The deliberation was real. The feeling of weighing options was real, but the outcome was not produced by the deliberation. The deliberation was the mind's way of narrating a conclusion that had already been reached by processes operating below the level of conscious awareness. You were watching the movie of your own decision and mistaking yourself for the director. Or consider the experience of driving a familiar route. You arrive at your destination and realize you have no memory of the last 10 minutes of driving. Your body navigated turns, adjusted speed, responded to traffic, all without the involvement of your conscious self. If the self were truly the one driving, who was at the wheel during those 10 minutes? The answer, according to the best neuroscience we have, is the same processes that are always at the wheel. The only difference is that during those 10 minutes, the narrative machinery of the brain was occupied elsewhere, and the story of conscious control was not being generated. The driving continued perfectly well without it. Albert Einstein, who spent much of his life wrestling with questions of determinism and free will, once offered a reflection that carries a surprising gentleness. Imagine, he said, that the moon, in the act of completing its orbit around the Earth, were gifted with self-consciousness. It would feel thoroughly convinced that it was traveling of its own accord. So would a being, endowed with higher insight, smile about humanity's illusion that it was acting according to its own free will. There is something both humbling and liberating in this image. The moon does not suffer because it lacks free will. It simply orbits, pulled by forces it did not choose and cannot resist, and it does so with a perfect, unconscious grace. If our sense of authorship is similarly illusory, if the feeling of choice is the brain's way of narrating a process it did not consciously initiate, does that make our lives less meaningful? Or does it open the door to a different kind of freedom, one that does not depend on being in control? Consider how much of your mental energy, on any given day, is spent on the project of being the controller. You wake up and immediately begin planning, strategizing, evaluating. You rehearse conversations before they happen. You imagine scenarios and calculate your responses. You monitor your own performance at work, in relationships, in parenting, in health, in fitness, in finances, maintaining a running commentary on how well the self is managing its various domains. This commentary is exhausting. It generates anxiety about the future, regret about the past, and a perpetual low-grade tension in the present, a feeling that you should be doing something, fixing something, optimizing something, because if you let your guard down for even a moment, things might fall apart. But what if the commentary is not actually what keeps things running? What if, like the driving on the familiar route, the business of living would continue perfectly well without the constant narration? What if the controller is not the source of your competence, but a passenger who insists on providing directions to a driver who already knows the way? This is where the ancient teachings of the Buddhist tradition meet the modern findings of neuroscience, not in contradiction, but in a startling resonance. Because Buddhism has been exploring the illusion of a controlling self for a very long time. Among the many philosophers and spiritual teachers alive in ancient India around the 5th century before the Common Era, there were two camps whose views the historical Buddha explicitly rejected. On one side stood the strict determinists, the most famous of whom was a figure named Macaulay Gosala, leader of the Ajivika school. Macaulay taught that everything in the universe was governed by fate, that a being's path through countless lifetimes was fixed, that no effort and no spiritual practice could alter the course of one's destiny. According to Macaulay, purification happened automatically over the course of an unimaginably long series of rebirths, like a ball of thread unrolling itself down a hill. You could not speed it up. You could not slow it down. What would happen was going to happen regardless of what you did. On the other side stood the indeterminists, those who argued that events arose without cause, that things simply happened with no discernible pattern or lawful regularity. If determinism made effort pointless, indeterminism made wisdom impossible. Without causality, there was no way to understand why suffering arose and no basis for a path that could bring suffering to an end. The Buddha walked between these two positions with remarkable precision. He rejected the idea that everything is predetermined because it leads to what the early texts call volitional impotence, the belief that nothing you do matters, which poisons the motivation to practice, to grow, to act with care and compassion. But he also rejected the idea that things arise without cause, because that would mean the world is random and unintelligible, offering no basis for the ethical and contemplative life he taught. What he offered instead was a teaching about conditionality, not rigid determinism, not random chance, but a universe governed by lawful patterns of cause and effect that include, crucially, a role for intentional action. In the Anguttara Nikaya, one of the principal collections of early Buddhist discourses, The Buddha specifically criticized two views: the view that everything one experiences is the result of past karma, and the view that everything is caused by the will of a creator God. Both, he said, were pernicious because both stripped human beings of agency and responsibility. The Buddhist scholar B. Alan Wallace, writing in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, summarized the Buddha's position this way: the Buddha rejected both the deterministic and indeterministic theories of his day. Our lives are deeply conditioned by cause and effect, refuting indeterminism. And we are personally responsible for our lives and actions, refuting determinism. But the Buddha also rejected the idea that there is an independent, autonomous self either apart from or within the aggregates that make up a person. The sense that each of us is an autonomous subject who exercises ultimate control over body and mind without being influenced by prior conditions is an illusion. This is a deeply nuanced position. It says, things happen for reasons. Your current experience is shaped by a vast web of conditions, some stretching back through your entire history, some arising fresh in this very moment. You are not separate from that web. There is no little homunculus sitting behind your eyes, pulling the levers of your body independently of the causal order. But within that web, there is a space, a narrow but real space, where the quality of your attention, the skillfulness of your response, the depth of your understanding can alter what happens next. The early Buddhist tradition described this using the metaphor of karma as a feedback loop rather than a straight line. Most of the Buddha's contemporaries taught karma in a simple, linear fashion. What you did in the past determines what you experience now, and what you do now determines what you experience in the future. Neat, tidy, and fatalistic, because if your present experience is entirely the product of the past, then there is nothing you can do about it now. But the Buddha taught something more dynamic. The Theravadan monk Thanissaro Bhikkhu has pointed out that the Buddha's teaching of karma operates in multiple feedback loops. The present moment is shaped both by past actions and by present actions. Your present actions shape not only the future, but also the present. You are not merely a passive recipient of the consequences of your past. You are an active participant in the unfolding of this moment, with a genuine, if conditioned, capacity to influence how things go. This is not free will in the Western philosophical sense, the uncaused freedom of an autonomous rational agent. The Buddhist tradition has no place for such a concept because it has no place for the kind of self that would exercise such freedom. But it is also emphatically not fatalism. It is something without a perfect English language equivalent, a conditioned freedom, a constrained but real capacity to respond with wisdom rather than habit, with clarity rather than confusion. And this is where the parallel with chaos theory becomes striking. In a chaotic system, the rules are fixed but the outcomes are open. Tiny shifts in conditions produce dramatically different results. In the Buddhist understanding of conditionality, the laws of cause and effect are reliable, but the outcomes are not predetermined because the present moment is not merely a consequence of the past. It is an active site of engagement where new causes are being generated all the time. Your life, in other words, is not a movie that was filmed before you were born. It is more like a river whose general direction is shaped by the landscape it flows through, the mountains, the valleys, the bedrock, but whose specific path, in any given moment, is influenced by the particular arrangement of stones and branches and currents it encounters. You cannot change the landscape, but you can, with skill and attention, place a stone here, remove a branch there, and alter the course of the water in ways that genuinely matter. The teaching of dependent origination, known in Sanskrit as praditya samutpada and in Pali as padaka samuppada, is often described as the single most important concept in all of Buddhist philosophy. It is the insight that is said to have arisen in the mind of the historical Buddha on the night of his awakening. And it is the principle that connects every other Buddhist teaching, from the nature of suffering to the possibility of liberation. In its simplest formulation, dependent origination says this: when this exists, that exists. When this arises, that arises. When this ceases to exist, that also ceases to exist. When this ceases, that ceases. Nothing poetic there at first glance. It sounds almost like a truism. Of course, things depend on other things. But the depth of this teaching unfolds as you sit with it. What it is really saying is that nothing, absolutely nothing, in the whole of conditioned existence has an independent, self-standing nature. Every phenomenon arises from the meeting of conditions and ceases when those conditions are no longer present. A flame depends on oxygen, fuel, and heat. Remove any one of these, and the flame goes out. It has no essence separate from the conditions that sustain it. The traditional Buddhist presentation of dependent origination spells this out through a chain of 12 links, 12 conditions that give rise to one another in a cycle that perpetuates suffering. The chain runs like this: rooted in ignorance, volitional formations arise. From volitional formations, consciousness arises. From consciousness, name and form, the totality of mental and physical existence. From name and form, the six sense bases: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and mind. From the six sense bases, contact. From contact, feeling, the basic experience of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neutrality. From feeling, craving. From craving, clinging. From clinging, becoming. From becoming, birth. From birth, aging and death, and all the sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair that come with them. It is important to understand that this chain is not a rigid sequence of dominoes falling one after another. The Buddhist teacher and scholar Joseph Goldstein and others have emphasized that the 12 links are better understood as a set of interlocking conditions that co-arise and reinforce each other, like the elements of a weather system. Ignorance does not cause volitional formations the way a cue ball causes a billiard ball to move. Rather, ignorance creates the climate in which certain kinds of volitional activity take root and flourish. And the chain can be interrupted. That is the whole point. The teaching of dependent origination is not merely descriptive, it is liberating. If suffering arises from identifiable conditions, then it can be ended by addressing those conditions. If craving arises from feeling, and you can learn to be present with feeling without automatically generating craving, you have interrupted the chain. If ignorance gives rise to the whole cycle, and you can develop insight that penetrates ignorance, you have undermined the foundation on which suffering is built. This has direct implications for our topic tonight. In a fully deterministic universe, the chain of dependent origination would be merely descriptive, a map of processes that unfold with inexorable necessity. There would be no point in trying to interrupt it because the attempt to interrupt it would itself be determined by prior causes. But in the Buddhist understanding, the present moment is not merely an echo of the past. It is a site where new conditions are being generated, where the quality of one's attention and intention can genuinely alter the trajectory of the causal process. Consider the link between feeling and craving. A pleasant sensation arises, the taste of something sweet, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the sound of a voice you love. In the absence of mindfulness, the mind lurches toward the pleasant feeling automatically, generating craving. I want more of this. This craving leads to clinging, to becoming, to the whole apparatus of suffering. But with mindfulness, something different can happen. The pleasant feeling still arises. Feelings are conditioned. They are not under your control. But the habitual leap from feeling to craving can be interrupted. You can notice the feeling without grabbing at it. You can let it be what it is, a momentary arising, a brief flowering of sensation, and then let it pass. The chain does not have to complete itself. The conditions for craving are present, but you have introduced a new condition, awareness, that changes the outcome. This is not a trivial achievement. Buddhist texts are honest about how difficult this is. The habits of craving and aversion are deeply ingrained, reinforced by countless repetitions over the course of a lifetime, and, in the traditional Buddhist view, over countless lifetimes. The default mode of the human mind is to react automatically. Pleasant feeling produces craving, unpleasant feeling produces aversion, neutral feeling produces boredom or numbness. Breaking this pattern requires sustained, disciplined attention, exactly the kind of attention cultivated in meditation practice. But the possibility of breaking it is real. That is the crucial point. The Buddhist tradition does not claim that human beings have unconditioned free will, the magical power to act independently of all causes and conditions. But it does claim that the present moment contains a genuine opening for wise action, an opening that depends on the cultivation of awareness, the development of insight, and the patient, persistent practice of attending to experience as it actually is rather than as we wish it to be. Thich Nhat Hanh, the beloved Vietnamese Zen master, captured this beautifully when he spoke of what he called interbeing. He pointed out that when you look at a sheet of paper, you can see the tree that became the paper, the rain that nourished the tree, the sun that powered its growth, the logger who felled it, the mill that pressed it. Nothing exists independently. Everything inter is, arising from a web of conditions so vast that it encompasses the entire universe. And yet, within that web, each moment offers the possibility of a fresh response. The teaching of dependent origination invites us to hold two things simultaneously. On one hand, we are thoroughly conditioned beings. Our bodies, our brains, our personalities, our habits, our preferences, all of these have been shaped by an inconceivably complex history of causes and conditions stretching back to the beginning of time. We did not choose our genes, our parents, our native language, our earliest experiences. We are, in a very real sense, the products of everything that came before us. On the other hand, this moment is alive. It is not merely a fossil of the past. New conditions are arising right now, in this breath, in this thought, in this flicker of attention. And among those conditions are the quality of your awareness and the intentions you bring to bear. These are not free in the sense of being uncaused. They themselves arise from conditions. But they are effective. They make a difference. They alter the trajectory of the causal web in ways that can lead toward greater suffering or toward liberation. If you are going to let go of the illusion of control, it helps to examine who you think is doing the controlling. In ordinary experience, there seems to be someone at the center of your life. A stable, continuous self that was born on a particular day, that has accumulated a particular set of memories, that holds particular opinions and desires, and that will, someday, die. This self feels like the most obvious thing in the world. It is so obvious that questioning it can feel like questioning whether you exist at all. But the Buddhist tradition has been questioning it for over 2.5 millennia, and its analysis is both more radical and more precise than many people expect. The teaching of anatta, often translated as no self or not self, does not claim that you do not exist. It does not say that your experiences are not real or that the person sitting here listening to these words is a figment of someone's imagination. What it says, instead, is that the self you imagine yourself to be, the stable, unified, independent entity that owns your body, authors your thoughts, and persists unchanged through time, cannot be found when you look for it carefully. The tool the Buddhist tradition offers for this investigation is the analysis of the 5 aggregates, known in Sanskrit as the skandhas. These are 5 categories that, taken together, are said to encompass the totality of human experience. They are form, meaning the physical body and its sense organs. Feeling, meaning the basic quality of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neutrality that accompanies every moment of experience. Perception, meaning the recognition and labeling of objects. Mental formations, a broad category that includes emotions, volitions, habits, and all the active processes of the mind. And consciousness, meaning awareness itself, the knowing quality of experience. The Pali word khanda, usually translated as aggregate, literally means heap or pile. This is not accidental. The point is that what we call a person is a heap of processes, not a unified entity. It is like calling a collection of auto parts a car. You can call it a car for convenience, and the label is useful, but there is no car essence separate from the parts. Take away the engine, the wheels, the chassis, the seats, and what you have left is not a ghost car. You have nothing. Similarly, the Buddhist analysis invites you to search for the self among the aggregates. Is the self the body? The body changes constantly, cells dying and being replaced, growing, aging, healing, decaying. The body you had at age 5 is materially almost entirely different from the body you have now. If the self were the body, which body would it be? Is the self your feelings? Feelings change moment to moment. Right now you might feel peaceful. An hour ago you might have felt anxious. Are you a different self every time your mood shifts? Is the self your perceptions, your thoughts, your habits, your consciousness? Each of these is in constant flux, arising and passing away in response to conditions, none of them stable, none of them independent, none of them possessing the characteristics we normally attribute to a self. The Heart Sutra, one of the most important texts in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, expresses this insight with breathtaking compression. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. The physical world is not separate from the absence of inherent existence, and the absence of inherent existence is not separate from the physical world. This is not nihilism. It is a statement about the nature of reality. Things exist, but not in the way we habitually believe they do. They exist as processes, as momentary arisings conditioned by other arisings, as flames that burn brightly, but have no essence apart from the conditions that sustain them. Now connect this back to our earlier discussion of neuroscience. Daniel Wegner's experiments showed that the feeling of being the author of your actions can be manipulated, created, and removed through changes in external conditions. Benjamin Libet's experiments showed that the brain begins the process of initiating an action before the conscious self becomes aware of it. These findings do not prove that there is no self in any sense, but they do suggest that the self, as we usually conceive it, the conscious agent sitting in the control room of the brain issuing commands to the body, may be a story rather than a description. Buddhism arrived at a similar conclusion by a very different route, not through brain scans and electrode arrays, but through the disciplined, sustained observation of one's own experience in meditation. When you sit quietly and observe your own mind with sufficient precision and persistence, what you find is not a thinker, but a process of thinking, not a feeler, but a process of feeling, not a controller, but an ever-shifting flow of conditions giving rise to conditions. Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, the Japanese Soto Zen teacher who founded the San Francisco Zen Center and whose book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, became one of the most widely read introductions to Zen in the Western world, once said something that captures this insight perfectly. What we call I, he said, is just a swinging door which moves when we inhale and when we exhale. A swinging door does not decide to swing. It responds to the air that moves through it. And yet the swinging is real. The air is real. The movement is real. Only the idea of a separate agent making the door swing is illusory. This is the heart of the Buddhist teaching on control. There is no one in control, not because nothing is happening, but but because what is happening is a process, not a person. The river flows. The wind blows. Thoughts arise. Actions occur. Causes produce effects. But there is no one standing apart from the river, directing its course. There is only the river itself, flowing. And this, far from being a cause for despair, is an invitation to an extraordinary kind of freedom, because the burden of the controlling self is enormous. The belief that you should be able to manage the unmanageable, predict the unpredictable, and maintain stability in a world that is constitutionally unstable. This belief is the root of an immense amount of suffering. When you release the belief that there is a self that should be in control, you release the suffering that comes from the inevitable failure of that control. You do not become a puppet. You do not become passive. You become, instead, something more like the river, responsive, dynamic, fully engaged with the landscape it moves through, but not fighting the law of gravity, not arguing with the shape of the bank, not insisting that the water should flow uphill, just flowing, meeting each obstacle as it arises, carving a path that is shaped by conditions but never predetermined by them. There is a word in the Pali language, the language in which many of the earliest Buddhist texts were recorded, that captures the quality of mind we have been circling around throughout this conversation. The word is upekkha, and it is usually translated as equanimity. But equanimity, in English, can sound bland. It can sound like not caring, like emotional flatness, like the shrug of someone who has given up. The Buddhist meaning of upekkha is something far richer and more alive than that. The word itself breaks down into two parts. The prefix upa means over or upon. The root ikka means to look or to see. So upekkha literally means something like looking upon or seeing with perspective. It is the capacity to see clearly without being thrown off balance by what you see. It is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of such thorough, such intimate, such deeply settled awareness that no feeling, however intense, can knock you off your seat. The Buddhist teacher Gil Fronsdal of the Insight Meditation Center describes equanimity as one of the most sublime emotions of Buddhist practice. It is the ground for wisdom and freedom and the protector of compassion and love. While some may think of equanimity as dry neutrality or cool aloofness, mature equanimity produces a radiance and warmth of being. The Buddha described a mind filled with equanimity as abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. Equanimity in the Buddhist tradition is not something you arrive at by deciding not to care. It arises from insight, specifically from seeing clearly the three characteristics that mark all conditioned experience: impermanence, the unsatisfactory nature of clinging, and the absence of a fixed self. When you truly see that everything is changing, that grasping at the changing guarantees suffering, and that there is no one separate from the process who could successfully grasp anyway, equanimity is the natural result. It is not a resignation. It is a settling. The mind relaxes its grip, not because it has been convinced to let go, but because it finally sees that there is nothing solid to hold. In the framework of the four Brahmaviharas, the four divine abodes or boundless qualities that the Buddhist tradition considers the highest states of the heart, equanimity stands alongside loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy. These four are not separate from each other. Loving kindness without equanimity becomes anxious attachment. Compassion without equanimity becomes overwhelm and burnout. Sympathetic joy without equanimity becomes giddy excitement that crashes when conditions change. Equanimity is the stabilizer, the ballast that keeps the ship of the heart upright in heavy seas. And this is where the physics we explored earlier becomes not just intellectually interesting, but existentially relevant. If the universe is a place where deterministic laws operate, but where outcomes are often unpredictable, where quantum processes introduce fundamental uncertainty, where the smallest change in initial conditions can cascade into enormous consequences, then equanimity is not just a nice spiritual quality. It is the only sane response. Think about it. If the world were fully deterministic and predictable, you could plan your way to happiness, map out the future, execute the plan, arrive at the destination. Control would be possible, and the desire for control would be reasonable. If the world were purely random, planning would be useless, but at least you could abandon the effort without guilt. Nothing you do matters, so relax. But the world is neither. It is a place where your actions have consequences, but where the full range of those consequences is beyond your ability to foresee or manage. Where causes produce effects, but where the causal web is so complex that no amount of effort can guarantee any particular outcome. Where effort matters, but control is impossible. This is the world you actually live in, right now, as you lie in the dark and listen to these words. Tomorrow morning, you will get up and go about your day. You will make decisions. You will take actions. Some of those actions will have the results you intended. Others will have results you never imagined, results that ripple outward through the chaotic dynamics of social life, of the economy, of the weather, of your own endlessly complex psychology. You will never know the full consequences of anything you do. You cannot. The system is too complex, the feedback loops too numerous, the sensitivities too profound. And here is the thing that the Buddhist tradition has been saying for over 2,500 years. That is fine. That is not a problem to be solved. It is the nature of reality to be recognized and embraced. The insistence that you should be able to predict and control the outcomes of your actions is itself a form of suffering. It is the grasping of the mind for a certainty that the universe does not offer, the clinging to an image of yourself as the master of your fate, when in fact you are a participant in a process so vast that mastery is a category error. The Dhammapada puts it with characteristic directness: gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. These are things that come and go. The wise, firm as a rock, are not shaken. Not because the wise do not experience gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. They experience all of it, but they experience it without the additional layer of suffering that comes from the belief that it should be otherwise. The wise person does not add a story on top of the experience. They do not insist that the praise should last, or that the blame is unfair, or that the pleasure should never end. They meet each moment as it is, with the full force of their attention, and then they let it go. Not because they do not care, because they see clearly that holding on does not work, has never worked, will never work. Because the nature of conditioned things is to change, and no amount of gripping can make the impermanent permanent. In such a world, the person who insists on controlling outcomes will be perpetually frustrated, because the world will perpetually refuse to cooperate. The person who gives up entirely will suffer too, through negligence and disconnection. The person who acts with care and skill while releasing attachment to outcomes, who does their best and then lets go, who participates fully in the unfolding of their life without insisting that it unfold in any particular way. That person is practicing equanimity, whether or not they have ever heard the word. The Zen tradition has its own way of expressing this. In Zen practice, particularly in the Soto lineage founded by Dogen Zenji in 13th century Japan and brought to America by Shunryu Suzuki in the 20th, there is a form of meditation called shikantaza, which translates as just sitting. In shikantaza, there is no technique to apply, no mantra to repeat, no breath to follow, no problem to solve. You sit, fully alert, completely present, utterly without agenda. Thoughts arise, feelings arise, sounds arise, the body breathes, and you sit with all of it, not trying to change anything, not trying to get anywhere, not trying to achieve any particular state of mind. Just sitting, just being. This practice is not passive. It requires enormous effort, not the effort of doing, but the effort of not doing, of resisting the deeply ingrained impulse to fix, manage, plan, control, and narrate. In Shikantaza, you discover how relentlessly the mind tries to take charge. It comments on the meditation. It evaluates its own performance. It plans what it will do after the sitting is over. It constructs elaborate theories about the nature of meditation. It does anything at all, to avoid simply being present without an agenda. And when those impulses are noticed and not followed, when the mind discovers that it can sit in the midst of the full catastrophe of experience without needing to manage it, something remarkable happens. Not a special state, not a mystical experience, just a quiet settling, a sense that things are already complete, that this moment, exactly as it is, with all its imperfection and uncertainty and ordinariness, is enough. Suzuki Roshi once said, "The true purpose of Zen is to see things as they are, to observe things as they are, and to let everything go as it goes. Not to make things go as you want them to go, not to understand why things go as they go, just to let them go as they go, and to be present for the going." This is not fatalism. Fatalism says, "Nothing I do matters." Equanimity says, "I will do what I can, with all the skill and care and compassion I can muster, and I will hold the results lightly, because the universe is too vast and too complex and too beautiful for me to manage." The Dhammapada, one of the most beloved texts in the Buddhist canon, contains a verse that has been recited at every Buddhist funeral in Theravada countries for centuries. Impermanent are all conditioned things. They arise and they cease. That is their nature. They come into being and pass away. Release from them is bliss supreme. Release here does not mean escape. It means release from the struggle against impermanence. Release from the insistence that things should be permanent. Release from the exhausting, impossible, heartbreaking effort to make the river hold still. The Buddhist practitioner who cultivates equanimity is not someone who has stopped caring. They are someone who cares so deeply, so thoroughly, so unconditionally, that they can hold the whole catastrophe of human existence in their awareness without flinching. They can look at suffering without turning away. They can look at joy without grasping. They can look at uncertainty without panic. They are not numb. They are fully alive, perhaps more fully alive than they have ever been, because they are no longer spending their energy fighting the way things are. And that is a very different thing from giving up. So where does all of this leave us? We have traveled from the clockwork universe of Newton and Laplace, through the tangled webs of chaos theory, down into the quantum fog, where particles refuse to commit to being anything in particular until someone asks. We have looked at what neuroscience has learned about the timing of conscious decisions and the brain's talent for creating the feeling of authorship. And we have explored the Buddhist teachings of dependent origination, not self, and equanimity, teachings that address the illusion of control not with abstract arguments, but with a practical path of training, meditation, and insight. Let us see if we can bring it all together. The universe, as our best science describes it, is a place of profound lawfulness and equally profound unpredictability. At the macroscopic scale, the laws of physics are deterministic. Planets orbit, bridges stand, the sun rises in the east. But at the scale of weather systems, ecosystems, and human brains, deterministic laws produce behavior so complex that it is, for all practical purposes, unpredictable. And at the quantum scale, the laws appear to be fundamentally probabilistic, containing a genuine element of openness, a refusal to be pinned down. This means that the universe does not need you to control it. It is already doing what it does, beautifully, catastrophically, with dazzling indifference to your plans. The weather will not consult your schedule. The economy will not respect your budget. The people you love will not always be who you need them to be. Your body will age. Your mind will sometimes fail you. Things you built will crumble. Things you never expected will bloom. The illusion of control is the belief that if you just plan hard enough, worry thoroughly enough, grip tightly enough, you can prevent these things from happening. It is the conviction that there is a self at the center of your experience that can and should manage the unmanageable, and that any failure to do so represents a personal deficiency. Buddhism does not argue with this belief. It does something more interesting. It invites you to look for the self that is supposedly doing the controlling, and to notice that you cannot find it. Not because it is hiding, because it is not there. What you find instead is a process, a constantly changing flow of sensations, perceptions, thoughts, intentions, and moments of awareness, none of which has the stability or independence that a true controller would need. And when you stop looking for the controller, something unexpected happens. You do not stop functioning. You do not become a vegetable. In fact, you may find that you function better than ever, because you are no longer wasting enormous amounts of energy on the project of maintaining the illusion of a separate self that is supposed to be running the show. The Zen tradition speaks of this as effortless effort, the paradoxical state in which action flows without the friction of self-conscious deliberation. A skilled pianist does not think about which finger to place on which key. A practiced cook does not consult a recipe for a dish they have made 1,000 times. The action arises from the situation, shaped by training and habit and sensitivity to conditions, and it flows without the interference of a separate I telling the fingers what to do. This is not mindlessness. It is a deeper kind of mindfulness, one in which awareness is so thorough and so intimate with the activity that the usual gap between self and action disappears. You and the playing are one. You and the cooking are one. You and the moment are one. Buddhism offers a set of practical tools for moving in this direction. The Noble Eightfold Path, the core ethical and contemplative framework of the tradition, is not a set of commandments imposed from outside. It is a description of how a person naturally lives when the illusion of a controlling self has been seen through. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. These are not rules to be followed by an obedient self. They are the natural expression of a life lived in alignment with the way things actually are. Right effort, in particular, is worth pausing on, because it might seem that if there is no self and control is an illusion, there would be no basis for effort at all. Why try? Who is trying? But the Buddhist concept of right effort is not the grim, teeth-clenching exertion of a self trying to force the world into compliance. It is more like the effort of a gardener, creating conditions in which something can grow, removing obstacles, watering, weeding, and then stepping back and letting the plant do what plants do. You cannot make a seed sprout through willpower. You cannot bully a flower into blooming. But you can prepare the soil, ensure adequate water and light, and protect the young plant from pests. The effort is real. It matters. It makes a genuine difference. But the outcome is not under your control. The plant will grow or it will not. The weather will cooperate or it will not. Life will unfold as it unfolds. This understanding transforms the way you relate to every area of your life. In your work, you bring your best skill and attention to the task at hand, and then you release the attachment to recognition, to promotion, to the specific ways in which the fruits of your labor manifest. You do the work because the work is worth doing, not because of what the work will get you. In your relationships, you show up with as much love and honesty and presence as you can muster, and then you let the other person be who they are, not who you need them to be for your own sense of security. You plant the seeds of kindness and patience and truthfulness, and you accept that you cannot control how those seeds are received. In your own inner life, you practice meditation not to achieve a particular mental state, but to cultivate the kind of awareness that can be present with any mental state. You sit not to become calm, but to be present with whatever arises, calm or agitated, focused or scattered, blissful or miserable. Over time, this changes the relationship between you and your experience. Not the experience itself, which continues to be as variable and unpredictable as it has always been, but the way you relate to it. You stop fighting. You stop insisting. You stop trying to nail the ocean to the floor. And in that stopping, something opens. Not a special experience. Not a transcendent state. Just space. The space that was always there but that you could not see because you were too busy trying to manage everything. The space between the stimulus and the response. The gap where Viktor Frankl said our freedom lives. The space where you can notice a feeling without acting on it. Where you can see a thought without believing it. Where you can experience the pull of habit without being dragged along. The Zen tradition has a phrase for this quality of engaged non-attachment. They call it no gaining idea. Suzuki Roshi spoke about it frequently. If your practice is good, he said, you may become proud of it. What you do is good, but something more is added to it. Pride is extra. Right effort is to get rid of something extra. The something extra is the self that takes credit. The something extra is the controller who evaluates and judges and demands results. The something extra is the belief that you are doing the practice, when in fact the practice is doing you. This is what it means to live without the leash of the illusion of control. Not to abandon effort, but to align your effort with the nature of reality rather than against it. To plant your seeds and do your weeding, and then let the garden be the garden. To act with full commitment while holding the results with an open hand. There is a quality of lightness that comes with this, a buoyancy that is not the same as carelessness. It is more like the difference between carrying a heavy suitcase and pulling a wheeled one. The journey is the same. The destination is the same. But when you stop fighting gravity and instead work with it, the whole endeavor becomes less exhausting. You have the same energy you always had, but now it is available for engagement rather than being consumed by resistance. There is a famous teaching in the Zen tradition attributed to the 9th century Chinese master Layman Pang, who was asked about the nature of spiritual practice. His response was simple. "My daily activities are not unusual," he said. "I'm just naturally in harmony with them, grasping nothing, discarding nothing. In every place, no hindrance, no conflict. Drawing water, carrying firewood. Drawing water, carrying firewood. Not escaping the ordinary. Not transcending the mundane. Not levitating above the mess of daily life. Just doing what is in front of you to do, completely, without the extra burden of a self that insists on being in charge." The physics we explored tonight tells us that the universe is both lawful and wild, that causes produce effects, but that the web of causation is so intricate that no mind can trace it. That at the deepest level, reality may contain a fundamental openness, a space where multiple outcomes are possible and nothing is written in advance. Buddhism takes that openness as an invitation, not an invitation to passivity, but an invitation to a more skillful, more intimate, more alive way of engaging with the world. The practice is not about controlling your experience. It is about meeting your experience with such thoroughness, such honesty, such unbearable tenderness, that the need for control falls away on its own. And here is something that might comfort the part of you that still wants evidence, still wants proof, still wants the reassurance of data. The neuroscience of contemplative practice over the past 2 decades has produced findings that are, by the cautious standards of brain research, remarkable. In 2005, Sarah Lazar and her colleagues at Harvard Medical School published a study in the journal Neuroreport that found measurable differences in the brain structure of experienced meditators compared to non-meditators. Specifically, long-term meditators showed increased cortical thickness in brain regions associated with attention, sensory processing, and interoception, the awareness of internal bodily states. The prefrontal cortex, which normally thins as people age, showed less age-related thinning in meditators. The brain, it appeared, was being physically reshaped by the sustained practice of paying attention. This was not an anomaly. In the years that followed, study after study confirmed and extended these findings. A team at Johns Hopkins, led by Madhav Goyal, conducted a meta-analysis of 47 randomized controlled trials involving over 3,500 participants and found that mindfulness meditation programs showed moderate evidence of improving anxiety, depression, and pain. The effect sizes were comparable to those found for antidepressant medications, though importantly, with far fewer side effects. Judson Brewer, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist at Brown University, used functional MRI scanning to study the brains of experienced meditators and found something particularly striking. During meditation, experienced practitioners showed decreased activity in the default mode network, a set of brain regions that is most active when the mind is wandering, when it is engaged in self-referential thinking, when it is running the endless inner monologue of planning, reminiscing, worrying, and fantasizing that occupies so much of our waking life. The default mode network is, in many ways, the neural correlate of the sense of self, the part of the brain that generates the feeling of being a separate somebody with a past and a future and an agenda. When meditators reported being in a state of open, non-judgmental awareness, this network quieted down. The self, at least as measured by the firing of neurons, was taking a rest. This does not mean that meditation erases the self. It means that meditation appears to give the practitioner a kind of flexibility, a capacity to engage the self-referential machinery of the brain when it is useful and to disengage it when it is not. And for most people, most of the time, the default mode network is running far more than it needs to. It is like leaving the engine of your car idling 24 hours a day. The noise and the exhaust fumes are constant, and after a while you stop noticing them. Meditation is like learning to turn the engine off when you are not driving and discovering, often with genuine surprise, how quiet the world becomes. Richard Davidson, a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who has spent decades studying the brains of long-term meditators, including Tibetan Buddhist monks with tens of thousands of hours of practice, has found that sustained meditation practice is associated with lasting changes in brain function, not just during meditation but throughout the day. Experienced meditators showed higher levels of gamma wave activity, a type of neural oscillation associated with heightened states of awareness and cognitive integration, even when they were not meditating. Their brains, it seemed, had been trained into a different baseline, a quieter, more focused, more integrated mode of operation that persisted even when they were not on the cushion. None of this proves that Buddhism is true. Science does not work that way, but it does suggest that the practices the Buddhist tradition has been refining for over 2.5 millennia produce measurable, replicable changes in the brain and the body that are consistent with the claims the tradition makes. When Buddhism says that sustained mindful awareness can reduce suffering, neuroscience nods. When Buddhism says that the habitual sense of self can be softened through practice, neuroimaging confirms that the brain regions most associated with self-referential thinking do indeed quiet down. When Buddhism says that equanimity is a trainable quality, the data show that people who practice meditation do, in fact, show greater emotional regulation and less reactivity to stressful stimuli. The psychologist Ellen Langer, working at Harvard since the 1970s, has spent her career studying what she calls the illusion of control, the tendency of human beings to overestimate their influence over events that are, in reality, beyond their control. In a classic experiment published in 1975, Langer showed that people who were allowed to choose their own lottery ticket believed they had a better chance of winning than people who were given a ticket at random, even though the choice of ticket had absolutely no effect on the odds. In another study, she found that people who threw dice themselves believed they could influence the outcome more than people who watched someone else throw the dice. The mere sensation of agency, the feeling of being the one who acts, was enough to create the belief that the outcome was under control. Langer's research has extended into dozens of domains, from gambling behavior to health outcomes to the aging process itself. Her consistent finding is that human beings are deeply, persistently inclined to believe that they have more control than they actually do. This is not stupidity. It is a feature of the way the brain is wired, a cognitive shortcut that probably served our ancestors well on the savannah, where the confidence to act decisively could mean the difference between eating and being eaten. But in a complex modern world, this same cognitive shortcut leads to chronic stress, unrealistic expectations, and the particular kind of suffering that comes from believing you should be able to manage things that are inherently unmanageable. The Buddhist path does not try to argue you out of this belief through logic alone, though the intellectual arguments are there for those who find them helpful. Instead, it offers a practice, a systematic training of attention and awareness that allows you to see the belief in action, to notice the moment when the mind reaches out to grasp, to control, to manage, and to discover, through your own direct observation, that the grasping does not work, that the hand closes on air, that the controller cannot be found, that the effort of control is itself the source of much of the tension and exhaustion you carry through your days. And in seeing that, clearly and repeatedly, the grip loosens on its own, not because you decided to let go, but because you finally understood, not just with your intellect, but with your whole body and mind, that there was never anything to hold on to. The Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck once described Zen practice as being the moment with no attempt to escape. That is the whole of it. Being the moment, not managing the moment, not evaluating the moment, not wishing the moment were different, just being it. And when you do that, when you really do it, even for a few seconds, something changes. The grip loosens, the shoulders drop, the jaw unclenches, the breath deepens, not because you decided to relax, because the one who was trying so hard to stay in control took a brief nap, and the body, finally left to its own wisdom, found its own way to ease. The universe does not need your permission to unfold. It was unfolding for billions of years before you arrived, and it will continue to unfold for billions of years after you are gone. Your brief appearance in this vast, improbable, astonishing process is not diminished by the fact that you do not control it. If anything, it is magnified, because the appropriate response to being a tiny, temporary, conditioned process in an inconceivably vast and beautiful cosmos is not grief or resignation. It is wonder. It is gratitude. It is the wide-eyed, open-mouthed astonishment of a being who has been given the gift of awareness, however briefly, in a universe that did not have to produce awareness at all. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, consider releasing the grip just a little. Not all at once. That is not how it works. But just a little. Let one small piece of the illusion of control dissolve. Let one corner of the vast, elaborate project of managing your life go unattended. Let the river flow for a moment without your hand on the tiller. You might find that nothing terrible happens. You might find that the breath continues to breathe, that the heart continues to beat, that the world continues to turn, all without your supervision. You might find, in that moment of release, a quiet that has nothing to do with silence, a stillness that has nothing to do with stopping, A peace that does not depend on everything going your way, because it does not depend on anything going any particular way at all. The satellite overhead is still tracing its path. The electrons beneath your feet are still flickering between possibilities. The laws of the universe are still doing their work, vast and impersonal and more intricate than any mind will ever fully grasp. And you are part of all of it, not standing apart from it, observing and directing. Part of it, a wave in the ocean, a note in a chord that has been sounding since the beginning of time and will continue long after the last human ear has gone silent. And notice what happens. Notice how the breath breathes itself. Notice how the heart beats without being asked. Notice how thoughts arise and pass away like clouds, or like the quantum fluctuations of particles that never asked for permission to exist. Notice how you are already, in this moment, perfectly sustained by a universe that knows what it is doing even if you do not. Impermanent are all conditioned things. They arise and they cease. That is their nature. They come into being and pass away. And in the space between the arising and the passing away, you are here. Whole, complete, not in control, and free. Thank you so much for spending this time with us here on Boring Zen. If this exploration resonated with you, if it gave you something to sit with as you drift off to sleep, we would love it if you would hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every subscription helps us keep creating these long, quiet journeys into the deep questions. And if you know someone who might need to hear this tonight, someone who is gripping a little too tightly, someone who is exhausted by the project of trying to manage the unmanageable, share this video with them. We are all in this together, all of us temporary, conditioned, beautifully imperfect processes in a universe that is far stranger and far kinder than any of us can comprehend. Good night, sleep well, and may you rest in the ease of not needing to be in charge.